Okay, good evening, dear colleagues. Доброго вечора. Let's start our Ukrainian Studies Online colloquium. It's actually the second round of our colloquium, yeah, but the first one in this semester, winter semester at the Viadrina. So my name is Andriy Portnov. I am teaching Ukrainian and East European history at the European University Viadrina, Frankfurt Oder. And today it is our great pleasure to have Professor Serhii Plokhy as our first speaker. Before introducing Serhii, let me very briefly tell you about this colloquium and our chair in general. So, as some of you know, it is called Entangled History of Ukraine. It's probably the only one professorship in Western Europe, in Germany for sure, which has History of Ukraine in its title. And it is our pleasure to include this colloquium as part of our teaching and activities program. And of course, here, first and foremost, I would like to thank and to introduce my colleagues, the, let's say, Ukrainian Studies Colloquium team, if I may. So I'm talking about Bożena Kozakevich, Maria Kirsanova, Ellen Budinova, Lucas Yura, and myself. So we've tried our best to invite interesting speakers every Monday, 6 p.m. And we very much hope that all of you will participate in the discussion. So we'll have a talk first and then a discussion round. And that's actually the idea of this event, to be a platform for sharing ideas and views and confronting different approaches to broadly defined Ukrainian studies. So please feel free after the talk to ask your question directly. You may raise your hand or somehow show me that you have a question in mind, or you could also just write it in our chat and then I will read it. And we'll try our best to respond to every voice, to every comment, to every question here. Now, dear colleagues, it is my great pleasure to introduce briefly Serhii Plokhy, our tonight's speaker. So Professor Plokhy graduated from the Dnipro University, as it is called nowadays. It was called Dnipropetrovsk State University, named after the 13th anniversary of reunification of Ukraine with Russia over there in Soviet times. And there in Dnipro, he was a pupil, a student of a very important historian figure in Ukrainian Soviet historiography, Mykola Pavlovich Kovalsky. Then Serhii defended his PhD in Moscow and his second dissertation, that is in Germany, called Habilitation in Kyiv. And he was also one of the first, very first probably, historians from Ukraine who spent a research year in the United States. It was already in the late 80s, highly unusual experience and very interesting one. And in 1991, he started working at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. In the year of 2007, Serhii Plokhy was appointed to the position of a Mikhail Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard. And in the year 2013, he became the director of Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And of course, as you could imagine, our small chair is proud and happy to have regular contacts and partnership with this institution. Serhii Plokhy wrote numerous books. You know, if I just give you the entire list, it will take some time. So that is not what I'm going to do now. I just want to mention two most recent book publications. I hope I'm correct that they are the most recent, maybe even something new. So the first one is called Nuclear Folly, A New History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I would dare to say that this book somehow continues Serhii's publications on Yalta Conference and post-Second World War world. Then the book on the, let's say, broadly defined story of Bandera killing and KGB operations behind it. And also his very important book about Chernobyl catastrophe, Chernobyl disaster, and what happened afterwards. And the second one is a collection of essays called The Frontline, Essays on Ukraine's Past and present. It's a very new one, just published at Harvard. Of course, everybody is more than welcomed to read it and to review it, actually, and maybe even to ask questions about it. There are two kind of, let's say personal points, if I may, I'd like to mention now as well. So the first one is that accidentally, maybe not accidentally, Serhii, Plokhy, and me, we are kind of sharing the same alma mater, so Dnipro National University. And still, despite that, we first met not in Dnipro, not in Ukraine, not even in Europe. We first met in Sydney at the Congress of Historical Sciences in Australia. So think about it, how history writing and Ukrainian studies, how they became global after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the new situation we live in now. And the second thing, which actually I value a lot and I like a lot, I want to remind you that in the year of 1995, in Slavic Review, the leading American journal in Slavic studies, there was a very important discussion around an article by Mark von Hagen, late Mark von Hagen. Does Ukraine have a history? Provocative title, very interesting, let's say, conversation included. And there was also Serhii Plokhy's piece in this discussion. And in this text, he wrote, let me quote, if I may, very briefly. It is doubtful that any new chairs of Ukrainian history will be established in the US, except those endowed by Ukrainians. It is much more probable that such chairs will be established in Germany or Austria. It was written in 1995, and it became true in 2018. So, dear Serhii, it's our great pleasure to have you with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Andrei. It's a real pleasure to join you, even if virtually. And in terms of my prediction, I think if you wait long enough, almost anything can happen. So it's the question of timing. But I'm really very happy that there is a position in Germany, and I hope there will be more positions like that. And that the work that you are doing is certainly path-breaking one way or another. So I'm very, very pleased to be part of that work. I also want to say that Andrei, you mentioned the front line. So this is the book. It's really fresh out of press on Amazon.com. It's technically is still not out. It should be only out in November. And I'm very pleased also that there is interest in translating potentially it into German, and there are negotiations taking place now with IBEDM in particular. So again, if that happens, that will be certainly a very important development for me in terms of getting to the German readership, to the German colleagues, to students in Germany studying Ukraine and region. In terms of today's presentation, Andrei mentioned that the title of Mark von Hagen's piece in Slavic Review in 1995 was provocative. Does Ukraine have a history? So probably the title of my today's presentation are Russians and Ukrainians, so Ukrainians and Russians, one and the same people, is not less provocative, maybe even more. But the provocation is not really mine. The provocation comes from the recently released article written or signed by the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. And the title of the article is on historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, but the agenda is certainly broader. And I'll quote just the opening sentence, the opening a paragraph of that article where it is stated, during the recent direct line, means the line between the president of Russia and the public in general, TV. When I was asked, this is Putin saying, about Russian-Ukrainian relations, I said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. These words were not driven by some short-term considerations or prompted by current political context. And so that from the first sentence, it's clear that it's not just about historical unity, it's not about history, it's just a belief that there is one nation. And Putin later in the article says that he really believes that there is a single large nation, a triunity nation, Belarusians. So what I will try to do today, I'm not going to go just sentence by sentence and try to say, okay, here is Putin wrong and here is he potentially right. I want to look at the foundations of that belief. Because clearly it didn't start with Putin. It is not limited only to Putin. It has deep historical roots and foundations, in particular the idea of the triunite Russian nation, a big Russian nation, as Alexei Miller put it in his book on the Ukrainian question in the 19th century. And that is the first task of my today's presentation, and to look at the roots of this idea. So to a degree, it's an exercise in intellectual history, looking at the roots of the ideas through different texts, but also the text associated with historiography. So that's why historiographic perspective is in the title. But also, given that this is a public lecture, what I will try to do, there will be a second layer in my presentation, and that will be providing some basic background on the history of Ukraine and history of the region and history of Russia as well. So again, I hope it will not be too long, but I think it is necessary to understand the argument that I'll try to develop. The time is limited. Again, probably it will be 35, 40 minutes. At least I try to stick to that recommendation that I got from the organizers of the event. But I will walk you in that short period of time through a good part of the history of Ukraine, history of Russia, and history of region, starting really in the 15th century and then bringing into the 20th and 21st century, focusing on some key historical developments and key developments in the development of the idea of relationship between the East Slavs in general and Russia and Ukraine in particular. So that is the task that I'm putting in front of myself now as I start this discussion. First, the question about the certainly origins of Russia and Ukraine. This is a debate that is going on for a long period of time, more than 100 years. Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the leading historian of Ukraine of the late 19th and early 20th century, after whom the chair of Ukrainian history at Harvard is named, was an important participant in that debate. And the debate was about the origins of the Kievan Rus and whether the Kievan Rus was a Ukrainian state, whether it was a Russian state. And the debate was going all the way into the 1920s, with Ukrainians advancing, and in particular Hrushevsky, advancing the argument that Kievan Rus was a Ukrainian state. The argument was advanced against the idea that existed in Russian historiography, that it was basically a Russian state. What today's actually historians say, looking at the medieval formation of Kievan Rus, contemporary nations in our today's understanding of the term, we see really a conglomerate of the tribes, a conglomerate of different groups, which are at the very top would be dominated by the Scandinavians, and the key element of the elite would be mostly Slavic elite. But there is a well-established mythology around the Kievan Rus, and part of that mythology is that there was a unity of one Russian nation before the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. And then that unity somehow disintegrated. And that argument, that line of thinking is also represented in Putin's article. He writes about the Mongol invasion and the start of the disintegration. Well, the argument is flawed on many levels. Again, it was probably, it reflects our understanding or the understanding of the field of the 19th century. But if you look at the map of the Kievan Rus and then before the Mongols and after them, you will see that the Mongols actually are not contributing to the disintegration of the state, which was already disintegrated, and there were multiplicity, dozens of different principalities out there. But the Mongols are the ones who are actually the gatherer of the Rus lands. They're combining them together in what eventually becomes the three major groups of principalities and Rus lands. One would be Galicia-Volhynia, that's mostly on the territory of today's Ukraine, and on territory of today's Russia, there would be the Grand Principality of Vladimir, and then the Novgorod Republic. So this is a unification, not disintegration, if you compare to what was happening in 2014, where there were, as I said, dozens of those principalities. But the idea of the unity of the Kievan Rus still very much became part of the historiography as it emerged in the early modern period and then in the modern era. So again, as I say, historically it is flawed, but the idea of the unity has been there since the emergence of the modern historiography. And there were good political reasons actually for enforcing that idea. And the Russian princes and Russian tsars are in the forefront of that process already starting with the 15th century. The reason, in particular, there is the first ruler of Moscow who called himself Tsar, Ivan III, the leader who really establishes early modern Russia as a fully independent state from the control of the steppe, from the control of the Tatar hordes. And in establishing that state, he laid a claim for Novgorod in particular. And Novgorod didn't want to be part of that Principality of Moscow that is being formed and emerged at that time. And the argument that was developed by people around Ivan III was that exactly the argument about the Rus unity and the right of the Muscovite princes as the members of the Rurika dynasty for Novgorod. And to establish this argument, to establish this claim, it was extremely important to establish the continuity between Moscow and Kiev. And this is we are talking really about the contest for the heritage of the Kievan Rus of the 15th century, where the claim for the Rus unity before that, the claim that you are a continuator in terms of your power, in terms of your authority, of the power of the Kievan Rus becomes politically very important. And this is really when you look at the origins of the Russian thinking about Kiev, about the importance of Kiev. This is really the turning point. This is the beginning. It coincides also with the period of the formation of the Russian state as an independent state. And one of its foundational mythologies is this connection to Kiev, because partially also because it is so important for the contest, in this particular case, control over Novgorod, not of Kiev per se. Kiev would come later, but the first argument about Kiev is related to Novgorod. Let me now skip a couple of not just decades, but also centuries, given the shortage of the time that we have here, and get to another turning point in the development of the mythology of the unity of Rus in general and eventually Russia and Ukraine. And this is this mid-17th century. Mid-17th century, the Cossack revolt, the Cossack revolution, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Pereyaslav Agreement of 1654, where the Cossack officers accept the authority, accept the protectorate, really, of the Russian Tsar over their newly created state, a state that in historiography is known as Hetmanate. In the 19th century and then later, in the 20th century, the Pereyaslav Agreement and this acceptance of the Russian Tsar as a suzerain, or Muscovite Tsar, as a suzerain over Ukraine, became a part of well-developed, again, mythology. In the 19th century, it started as a key point, turning point in the history of reunification of Rus. So the idea is that Rus was united. There was one nation, one state. Then it was destroyed by the Mongols, that unity. We talked already about that. And on that myth, there is another myth is being built and created that the unity was eventually restored. And the unity of the Rus was restored in 1654. By Bogdan Khmelnytsky on the one hand, and by the Russian elite and the Muscovite Tsar, the Tsar of Russia on the other hand. In the Soviet times, in 1954, and Professor Portnov mentioned the name of the university that we graduated from, 300-year anniversary of reunification of Ukraine and Russia. In the 1950s, it was difficult to talk about the reunification of Rus. There was already established narrative that there are three separate Slavic nations or peoples. So the term Rus is replaced with terms Ukraine and Russia, but reunification paradigm is still there. And the term reunited is also present in Putin's article. He writes in particular about the second half of the 17th century. The Russian state incorporated the city of Kiev and the lands of the left bank of the Dnieper, including Poltava region, Chernigov region, and Zaporozhye. Their inhabitants were reunited with the main part of the Russian Orthodox people. These territories were referred to as Malorossiya, or Little Russia. So again, the reunification paradigm starting in the second half of the 17th century, going through the Soviet incarnation, is still well and alive, certainly in today's Russia. Now, what really happened in Pereyaslav in 1654? This is, by the way, one of the subjects of the essays that went into the book that I just introduced to you, the frontline essays on Ukraine's past and present. Well, the point is that no one in Pereyaslav in 1654 thinks in terms of reunification. And the dominant discourse, or maybe the only discourse that exists there when you look at the documents associated with 1654, it's about the religious unity. So this is the war of this is the era of Reformation, counter-Reformation, the wars of religion, where the religious identity is the key. And the justification of this alliance between the Cossack officers and the rising Muscovite state is produced exactly in the context of this religious discourse of the time. The idea of nation is not completely foreign at that time for the region. But in terms of nation, think only the monks of the Kievan Caves monastery at that time, educated elites. This idea is not known yet in Moscow at that time. The Kievan elites borrow it certainly from the Polish discourse at that time, Naruto Nation. And in the second half of the 17th century, they produce a very important text, which is called Synopsis, which becomes the textbook of Russian history through the most of the 18th century, from the last decades of the 17th century into the 19th century, which in the title has the term Kiev as the first capital, Prince Volodymyr or Prince Vladimir as the first autocrat and the first sovereign, but it also has the term and the concept of nation. Synopsis went through more than 24 editions and re-editions in the Russian Empire in the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. And it is interesting that in Russia at the beginning of the 18th century, the term nation was a foreign term. It was translated as a state. So if you look at the editions of synopsis in the 18th century in the Russian Empire, the nation disappears, the state is there. So the concept of nation is there, but it's just one group that is pushing it. And what is interesting compared to the story that I just discussed before that about Ivan III, the battle for Novgorod, this idea of unity as nation is pushed not now by the Russian side. It is pushed by the monks of the Kievan monastery. So it's very Kievan Caves monastery. So the nation as such, the concept is very much of Kievan origins. And the reason for that is that they just already are familiar, they acquired the vocabulary, the conceptual framework that exists at that time in Europe and which is not yet known in Russia. By the 18th century, nation, of course, becomes the term that is familiar in Russia, that has become key term in Russia, in the Russian Empire itself. And there is a growing number of literature on the subject of the Russian nation building of the 18th century, which says that the alumni of Kiev Mohyla Academy were among the first Russian nation builders of the 18th century. But the Russian nation is an imperial nation that encompasses all population of the Russian Empire altogether. In particular, of course, the Eastern Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. And that is the 18th century Russian imperial nation. That is the model that is there. It's part of the imperial vocabulary, part of the imperial discourse, part of the imperial repertoire in the 18th century until the partitions of Poland and until the time when the Polish national mobilization creates a challenge and creates a problem to this idea and the concept of the imperial nation, which has no relation to the language that people speak in their localities, to the spoken language, no relation to the folklore, no relation to the traditions of history writing in particular parts and particular regions. But that becomes an ideal concept of the Russian Empire as it tries to transform into the age, transform itself during the age of nationalism in the 19th century. So what do we have so far? Let me summarize again. There are a lot of centuries, a lot of names, but in terms of the concepts, if we simplify that, we start with the 15th century, with the idea of the unity based on the rights of dynastic rights of the Russian rulers, and they're linked and connected to Kiev. Then by the 17th century, you have the rise of the concept of national unity. So it's not the Imperial in 1654, but after that, it is being developed that it is actually also not just dynastic connection there is also this national component there. But in the conditions of the 18th century, it is really not nation and empire from that point of view work together, sort of reinforcing each other. This 18th century concept of nation is not the nation of the 19th century of a German model in particular, associated with the language, with the folklore, with the culture of a particular group. And then comes 19th century and comes the German model of the national mobilization. And the question is, what happens then with the the idea that was formed in the 18th century about empire equals nation, and Slavic core is of course is a quintessential Russian nation. Well, Poles, to a degree, they wake up Ukrainians, and they wake Belarusian national movement in particular after the uprising, the Polish uprising of 1830s. And the empire has somehow reacted to this national mobilization within the East Slavic core of the empire, because the empire is really threatened by that mobilization. And it reacts on a number of levels. One of those levels is that the attempt to preserve the unity, ideal unity of the Russian nation as it was formed in the 18th century, but make some accommodations, some adjustments to the growing national movement. And what emerges in the 19th century is the concept of the three-partite nation, Russian nation, that includes Great Russians, Little Russians, and Belarusians, Little Russians, Ukrainians. So this is exactly the model that is actually the favorite model now of Vladimir Putin, if you look at his writings. It emerges by the mid-19th century. And its origins is actually much more maybe complicated and interesting than is normally imagined. In the second half of the 17th century, Great Russia, Little Russia, and White Russia were already part of the official title of the Russian Tsars. But they disappear from that title once Peter becomes the All-Russian Emperor. So the term changes. So 18th century creation, the All-Russian nation, the All-Russian Empire is there. And normally people make this connection between the second half of the 17th century, the title of the Russian Tsars, and the emergence of the concept of the three-partite nation consisted of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. The importance of that connection, in my opinion, is overestimated, because in one case we deal with the rights of a ruler associated with the dynasty. In other case, we already deal with the concept that is rooted in the ideas of language, separate literature, culture, and so on and so forth. And to show that that connection is not direct and complicated, I just want to suggest that in the second half, in the middle in particular, of the 19th century, there are two concepts that are actually competing with each other. One of them is that the East Slavs are divided not into three groups, but they're divided into two groups. Ukrainians would be called by the, I would say in political terms, the founder of the modern Ukrainian national idea, Mykola Kostomarov. They would call Southern Russians. And then Northern Russians would be Russians, which leaves no place for the Belarusians, which were according to Kostomarov and Serhii and other people working in Kharkiv in particular and later in Kiev, they were part of the subdivision of the Great Russian nation. And then there was another concept associated with Shakharzyk and with Bodyansky and others, that actually there are three groups and Belarusians are part of that. And it is that three-partite model of the Russian nation emerges victorious in this contest with the two-partite nation. Now, the point is that it's a concession to the rising national movement, with the idea of still keep unity together. So yes, you can use your own language, but you can't really have it on the university level. You can't have high culture, And that's where in the second half of the 17th century, the Russian Empire really uses the power of the state to keep the constituent part of this big Russian nation from developing into their own independent nations. To develop into your own independent nation, you have to turn your language, your spoken language, into the higher language of literature and culture. And this is exactly where in the 19th century, the Russian Empire introduces at least two pieces of legislation or documents regulating the development of the language. One of them is Valuev Circular of 1863, and another is the Amsukaz, which comes in the 1870s. Again, the idea is to arrest the development of the nation and to keep the three-party nation together. So no one is saying that Little Russians don't exist, and no one says that, okay, Little Russians are not allowed to speak their language at home. But the Little Russians are not supposed to have grammar and go to school and learn their grammar there. They're not supposed to have high literature in their language, and so on and so forth. And with some variations, this is the model, this is the concept that exists up until the revolutionary period in the history of the Russian Empire. So the cracks appear already in 1905. With the limitations on the publication in Ukrainian language being lifted during the revolution of 1905-1907. And then comes along the revolution of 1917 and the really disintegration of the Russian Empire. Emergence on its ruins a number of the states, or if not states, then at least governments, that claim the right of their respective nations for state existence, for independence, first autonomy and federalism, and then by 1918, you see independence there as well. And again, what happens is that the regime emerged successful in reintegration back the most part of the Russian Empire, and that regime was the Bolshevik regime. It had to somehow adjust to the new realities, political realities in the first place. And what you see that the Bolshevik regime allows, at least in the 1920s, the imperial concept of the big Russian nation, consisting of the three tribes, but still one unified nation, it allows it to go. It accepts the idea that Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are separate nations, separate groups. It is a very important development for the future of Ukrainian project, Belarusian project. But the most important it is for the Russian project. Because as the result of this transformation and then the creation of the Soviet Union, Russians for the first time acquire the borders of their own, the institutions of their own, within a broader imperial space, something that they didn't have before. And out of that really comes the mobilization of 1989, 1990, 1991 that was led by Boris Yeltsin in particular, and not just disintegration of the Soviet Union, but the emergence of the Russian Federation as a separate entity and as a separate state. Most of Vladimir Putin's article deals exactly with this story of the 20th century, and I'll quote, he says that he talks about the disintegration of the Soviet Union as the disintegration of the historical and spiritual space, which to my mind is our great common misfortune and tragedy. So it's very, very similar to the way how he discusses the fall of the Soviet Union in general. And he continues, these are first and foremost the consequences of our own mistakes made at different periods of time, but these are also the result of deliberate efforts by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. So basically, in his understanding, there are not some processes of the formation of the nations and the disintegration of empires, which are at work in the Soviet space, but there are mistakes that were made, and there are evil intentions of the outside forces. So these are the two factors that are responsible for the formation of separate nations and national identities. And he is very critical about the Soviet period in general. The question is, and I know that I'm already talking for a while, it's time to maybe wrap up this part of the discussion. The question is where specifically in that text these ideas come from, the ideas of the three-partite nation, the very critical take on the nationality policies of the Soviet Union, and also the argument that it's the mistaken policy of the Bolsheviks that really created the monster out of Ukraine and out of Ukrainian nationalism. The article doesn't have references, but if you look at Putin's other pronouncements, public and otherwise, that become known, certainly keeps in a great respect Alexander Solzhenitsyn in particular, and certainly the critique of the Soviet policy in general and the Soviet nationality policy resonates very much with Solzhenitsyn. And Solzhenitsyn's idea of Russian nationalism is also very much rooted in pre-1917 thinking about Russian nation. Again, Solzhenitsyn himself, he writes, is part Ukrainian, part Russian. So his Russian nationalism and his idea of how we should restructure Russia, published in 1990, is the idea of keeping this core, East Slavic core together. So he recognizes that, okay, that people can speak different languages, have different songs and so on and so forth, but at the end of the day, they constitute one unity. And in this sense, again, I make these connections again based on the context in general of Putin's pronouncements before. But it's in my opinion, a missing link in terms of the intellectual history and development between the ideas of the second half of the 19th century and this revival of the imperial thinking and imperial ideology already after the fall of the Soviet Union in after 1991, and now in the context, of course, of the Russian-Ukrainian war. So despite the fact that the article has some certainly connections and some parallels with the parts of the Soviet discourse, again, reunification is there, but reunification is also part of the imperial discourse of the 19th century. So in terms of the genealogy of the ideas, I would put my finger really on the ideas of the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century in the Russian Empire. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any questions, and again put more emphasis hopefully in my responses on Ukraine per se, given that we are the focus of this talks and this seminar presentations is Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, dear colleagues, please feel free to write your question here on the chat, or just ask it, maybe like by raising hand or whatever. I assume it's always like that. Someone should start. Okay, let me then start, maybe very briefly. I am curious because, I've read recently in one interview published by the Russian Kommersant, yeah, so this leading newspaper, yeah, Gazprom Media and so on. And there was an interview with several people about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah, they were kind of, like recollecting events. And in one of those interviews, you've probably read it, there was a point that during Andropov's reign, as we know, it was a pretty short one. So after Brezhnev's death, and then Andropov died himself pretty soon. But still, during his time as a first secretary general of the Communist Party, there was an idea that was seriously discussed, according to this interview, to make a new administrative division of the Soviet Union, and first and foremost, to divide Ukraine into two Ukraines, using the Dnieper River as the border. So I'm curious, first of all, whether there is some evidence for that, because for me it was something new, but I'm not a specialist in this particular field. And secondly, I'm curious, what is your explanation why, despite some discussions, hidden or open, that this quasi-nation state structure of the Soviet Union is a danger for the system as a whole, why it still survived and preserved, despite, everything? So it was constructed like that when Lenin was still alive, and it ended up like that in 1991. I am, of course, also asking you, as also of this brilliant book about the end of the Soviet Union. So I'm just curious, how would you interpret this story?
Well, thank you for this question. The plans to somehow divide Ukraine into two parts, I really didn't see any evidence in the sources that I am familiar with. So if there were those ideas, they were quite marginal. They were not something that was considered on the Politburo level or discussed on that level. If those plans were there, I would imagine they could be an attempt to undermine the importance of the Ukrainian party elite, because we are talking about the period, the end of the almost 30-year period under first Khrushchev and then Brezhnev, when the Ukrainian party elite played this disproportionately important role in the Soviet Union. So again, I never encountered anything like that. If those ideas were there, I would link them to the competition between different elites immediately after Brezhnev's death. In terms of this structure of the Soviet Union, again, Putin in his article writes that this constitution with the right to succeed, that was a bomb that was put under the foundations of the Soviet Union. So the question is why that bomb was allowed to be there for so long. And my answer is that the people at the top, especially in the 1980s, believed that that bomb was disarmed long time ago. They believed their own propaganda that the nationality question was solved once and forever. There was some foundation for that optimism, given that by making concessions to the nationalities, the Soviet Union was able to preserve the imperial space when every other major empire in the world actually disintegrated. So there was a period of success associated with this accommodation of the nationalities. But then what you see is almost again in Stalin's term the головокружение от успеха. So by the time Gorbachev is in power, he really doesn't realize that he is presiding not over enlarged Russia, but over the Soviet Union. And he makes mistakes like in Kazakhstan, when he actually parachutes Kolbin there in disregard of the local elite and tradition that was established since Stalin's death. So there is really belief that the Soviet Union became that extended Russia, and that the local elites in the republics would go along with almost anything that Moscow would suggest. there is interesting research done that it was exactly during the Brezhnev period when the rhetoric was about the strengthening of the unity. And there was really the cultural Russification on many levels, but on the political levels, the local elites actually entrenched in those republics to a degree that was unthinkable, certainly during the early period. And again, the intelligentsia was, of course, unhappy with the cultural aspects of Russification and so on and so forth, and that these things came together in the late 1980s.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very interesting because my impression was also that probably, it was probably interviewed by Piotr Aven. Probably he just, he was talking about some informal discussions, whatever. Okay, now we have 3 very interesting questions in our chat, and we have Tim Byheld raising his hand. If I may, dear colleagues, I would give a floor to Tim, our colleague from Viadrina, and afterwards I'll read the questions from the chat and we'll respond them. So please, Tim, the floor is yours.
What an honor. Thank you, Andrei. And thank you, Serhii Plokhy, for this very interesting talk. I have a general question. What do you see as, in your own historiography, what do you see as driving forces now, especially with regard to this Russian-Ukrainian history? Because to me, it seems like there is a lot of contingency going on. If the Putsch people from August 1991 would have been more sophisticated, things would have been different. If the reaction in the republics a few days afterwards would have been different, the Soviet Union might have persisted. And also what happened then in December 1991 was also not very clear. And in fact, in 1996, it was the Americans and the West who helped Yeltsin to preserve, so to say, a vision of a unified Russia against the communists, which were looking for, the Communist Party, which was looking for reunification of post-Soviet lands. So there is a lot of, events and things might have gone differently. And I was just thinking, you finished your last, the book I read on the Lost Kingdom on Russian nationalism with a comparison in a way on Germany. And sometimes I wonder, if there was such a heavy crisis in Germany as there was in the late Soviet Union, Bavaria or Saxony, they had own states and own kingdoms. Would they have a right to call themselves their own people, to claim an own culture? Certainly. Maybe even more so in historical terms than Ukraine, because they had clear statements. So what is the relation between these long-term developments? Certainly there is something Ukrainian in all Russian history, something uniquely Ukrainian on the one hand, and then these very contingent developments, which we can see in the late 80s.
Thank you for this question. I will start maybe with the last part of the question, and this is comparing with Germany. And I will quote again Alexei Miller, from whom I borrowed the idea of the big Russian nation. It seems to me Putin is borrowing, or whoever wrote that article or contributed to it borrowed from the same source. And Miller's argument is that, again, first of all, and he shows that the Russian officials in the 19th century was really following what was happening in Europe, in particular in France. And why they were not able to succeed in arresting this actually development of the local languages, according to Miller, is that they used just repressive measures. And they didn't build the system of education, which would actually bring the Russian language, the standardized Russian language to those peripheries. So that is actually one argument. What I can say also, based on my own research, is when you look at the similarities and differences between the Belarusian and the Ukrainian national projects, Belarusian is later and weaker. And the contributing factor there is also the fact that Ukraine, ethnically Ukrainian territories, turned out to be divided by the imperial borders. And the existence of this other Ukraine in Austria-Hungary allowed the Ukraine in the Russian Empire to survive the prohibitions on the publication in particular. So the writers kept writing, but their works were published abroad. Their works were published in Austrian part of Ukraine. So the market still existed, contributing eventually. So these prohibitions contributed eventually to the creating of the link between east and west of Ukraine that otherwise would not be there. So again, a number of factors, I would say, contributed to the development in East Slavic world, which was different, let's say, from the development in France or development in Germany. In terms of how much of contingency has been there in the developments of the last 30, 35 years, the blank answer is a lot. But what we also see is that there is the 30, 35-year period also allow us to look at the tendencies, the things that are just, you push them aside and those certain things come back. So one of the things is that Ukraine declares its sovereignty, not independence, but sovereignty, which means in 1990, the primacy of the local laws over the union laws after Russia, right? So it's quite late in coming to this, to this process of sovereignization. And one of the reasons for that is the entrenchment of the local party communist elite that was actually stronger in Ukraine than it was in other areas. But then once those people are removed, Ukraine catches up and joins the broader all union process at that time, led by the Baltic states. So that is one factor. Another factor is the existence of the again part of Ukraine that during the interwar period was part of Poland or Romania or Czechoslovakia, where a different type of national mobilization was taking place. So that separates, if you look at Ukraine as a whole, that separates it from Belarus, that separates it from Russia as well. So Ukraine assumes the leading role in the disintegration of the Soviet Union only quite in the fall of 1991. So really after the coup. Before that, it is led certainly by the Baltic states, by the Caucasus, and the elite, the party elite, is very cautious. They declare independence of Ukraine in August 24th, but they say that actually we want it to be confirmed by the referendum, right? So they're buying time, they're looking what is going on, what is happening there. So you can say, okay, if they would not declare independence of August 24th, maybe things would go in different ways. But I would say that really they declared independence on December 1st. So there was a period of time, a preparation. So I'm looking at this as basically as a really broader trend associated with the disintegration of the imperial spaces all over the world, multi-ethnic states. At the same time, Yugoslavia has happened, Czechoslovakia has happened, the Soviet Union is there, and this is at the end of the century that saw the disintegration of those multi-ethnic states. The Soviet Union, because of the policies that were introduced in the 1920s, was able to postpone that collapse. That's my reading of things, but eventually it caught up with them as well. So thanks again for the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, accidentally, I have a book that was just mentioned. Let me show it. One of my favorite, I should say, Last Kingdom, The Quest for Empire and the Making of the Russian Nation, written by Serhii Plokhy. Now, dear colleagues, let me try to combine the questions from the chat and the live ones. Okay, so first of all, actually, and we've just heard the name of Alexei Miller. So it fits well to Irina Sklokina's question from Lviv. So thank you so much for a great presentation. Who is the author of Putin's article, in your opinion? Is it a product of historians' advice or purely PR specialist effort? And is it really worth speaking much about? Do you think discussing it can lead to some deeper results in historical policy and public opinion, or we need some asymmetrical response to it?
Well, thanks. It's one question only on the surface, but it's really full of a number of questions, and all of them are good and difficult to answer. So I'll start with the questions that is the easiest to answer. I don't know who wrote the Putin's article or co-author. What I can say is that it's basically the whoever contributed to producing it were really in a supportive role there, because the idea itself is there, and Putin kept talking about that for a long period of time. We know that he is an admirer of memoirs of Denikin, that he read other writers, the Russian Imperial or then writers in the immigration. So the details can be somebody else's, but generally this is my understanding that this is correctly, that the article correctly represents Putin's own ideas and vision. And that's what makes this article important politically, because we have there an expression of the views of the leader of the country, which is in war with Ukraine, which basically started aggression against Ukraine, which doesn't really see much space for the existence of a separate Ukrainian nation. And in today's world, that means actually not much space for the existence of the Ukrainian state as such. And to say that, again, historiographically, article is dated and intellectually is not interesting and so on and so forth, in my opinion, is missing the point. The point is political. And so leaving that article without reaction would be a major mistake, because it's a big again threat on a number of levels to the existence of Ukrainian state as such, not just of this region or that region, but of Ukrainian state as such. And the response can be just one: Ukraine is a democratic state, and the questions of Ukrainian history and Ukrainian identity are being discussed and debated in this context of the war more than ever before. So I think that open discussion has to be continued, and again this impulse that comes with Putin's article should not be ignored.
Thank you. And now we have a very interesting question also about a more historical one. So let me read it from Alexei Cherednichenko. So religious union definitely fits 1654 events better than national union. Still, isn't it possible to overstate the weight of the religious aspect as well? Ukrainian religious elites did not actively support union with Russia in 1640s, 50s. Political elites, while possibly preferring Russia as the only, except Moldavia, Orthodox state in the vicinity, still looked at such options as Sunni Turkey, Shah Persia, Protestant Transylvania and Sweden, and maybe even to some degree Catholic Venice. If it's all about religion, why did the union struggle so much even in the pre-national age?
It is not all about religion. The religion turned out to be the space where the two sides could have dialogue and presumably understand each other. In the case of the Ukrainian side of Ukrainian Cossacks, again, the big issue were the rights and liberties, right? That were viewed from the Russian side differently as something that can be actually granted by the Tsar, but not your own rights and not your own liberty. So their much of understanding could not be reached. But in religion, they could use the same language. So it's a rhetorical framing of a particular event. What went into that event was, of course, much more than religion. And even religious unity was questioned at that time. A few decades earlier, the Muscovite church rebaptized the Orthodox Belarusian and Ukrainian Orthodox because they were considered to be not purely Orthodox. They lived together and shared food with non-Orthodox, right? So even religious unity was questionable. Now, the issue of religion and the different attitude of the elites versus masses. Well, for the masses, that had certainly was also very appealing argument. When the elites, as traditionally, were much more freer in choosing their alliances and choosing their preferences. They were thinking in terms of the position of the state. They were thinking in terms of the position of their own social group, either dealing with the Ottomans or dealing with the Kingdom of Poland. With the Ottomans, Hetman found himself a completely legitimate leader, because in the Ottoman political culture, God gave you, so you have the right to be there. In the European, you have to have a certain pedigree. You have to come from a ruling dynasty. So this is just one example. Interesting case is the period between the Battle of Poltava in 1709, 1708, 1709, when the Swedish army is in Ukraine, the Russian army is in Ukraine, and there is a war of manifestos before the battle for at least half of a year, trying to convince the population of the Hetmanate who is right, the Russian Tsar or Mazepa and Hetman Mazepa and people around him. And Russia really played the card of the fact that Charles XII was a Protestant, that it wasn't Orthodox. The idea that the union, the Catholic Union, would be brought there, and so on and so forth. So Russia really took full advantage of this alliance between the Orthodox Hetman Mazepa and the Protestant King Charles XII to delegitimize the Mazepa altogether. So again, the point is, religion doesn't explain everything, but religion is an important part of those equations. And again, nation comes, and national thinking comes later.
Okay, thank you very much. And now, if I may say, we have more questions on chat. I'm very happy about it. But before doing that, let's listen to Valeria Korobleva and your question or comment, maybe, please.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Good evening, colleagues, and congratulations on the new season of the Colloquium. And Serhii, thank you for this brilliant talk. I want to pick up on what I see as the underlying framework, that actually all these models are driven with some sort of political or even geopolitical rationality, right? So the authors and the users of these models, they are trying to adopt the vocabulary or the dominant narratives that are sort of legitimate in a broader, let's say, European context, right? So my question is about the contemporary discourse. If we assume that the line of thinking is the same, that all these instrumentalization of historical arguments have some geopolitical incentives behind, my question is, how do they fit the contemporary dominant ways of legitimizing some geopolitical claims? Like, if assuming that the main idea is to reclaim the great power status, how does this model of three-partite nation work here? Because I believe that the last the large part of this argument is already lost, because nowadays there's no need to prove any ancient roots or vast land masses or whatever, whereas the heredity with the Soviet Union is unquestioned. As you all probably know, in everyday parlance, like Russia and the Soviet Union are oftentimes used interchangeably. So how is it used how does it feed the broader dominant discourse of pretensions for power? Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thank you. This is a good question. First of all, I'll start where I ended a comment on one of the earlier questions, that I believe that this historical thinking, instrumentalization of history, is very important for Vladimir Putin. So he's not just, his name is there in the article, that he probably believes in that. Then you compare to what is happening in the actual policy of Russia. And you see a gap between that declared belief and the policy. Because on the one hand, there is a declared unity, but there is no, till now, it can change tomorrow. I have to be careful, but till now, there is no major concerted effort to reunite even Belarus, which is there hanging out there actually as part of the one unified state already for 20 or 25 years, right? There is no attempt at this point, we will see what will happen later, to integrate fully Donbass the way how the Crimea was integrated. So what I see there is that Crimea is integrated and it's the majority of ethnic Russians are there. So Russians are included, but the Russian-speaking non-Russians actually are hanging out there. So the question is not really of integrating them in the Russian Federation, but the issue is formation of a military bloc and economic bloc and political bloc, and formation of the buffer states around the Russian Federation. I see it because I look at that from the perspective of a historian. There is probably more things that are happening, but these are most obvious for me as a historian, because the idea of the buffer states and so on and so forth is there. It's imperial concept, is the concept that is there certainly under Joseph Stalin, with the creation of this Warsaw Pact and Eastern Europe there, and the same thinking, strategic thinking about control of the territories around Russia, or the Soviet Union, or Russian Federation today, it continues. So I see a disconnect between really the beliefs and the actual policies. So I think that in terms of instrumentalization, that those beliefs are used to achieve actually not the goals of reunification per se within one state, but the goals of the creation and strengthening the sphere of influence, strengthening the bloc that would be competitive with European Union, which would be somehow able to withstand what will come from the East, from China. So that is my understanding in terms of geopolitical thinking versus historical, and there is I see disconnect between the two.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have some questions. Some of them are pretty broad, but let's maybe try to answer them briefly. But as I said, it's up to you, up to us to decide how long would we like to continue discussion. So first of all, a question from Dnipro, from Katerina Grishenko. It's about the future. So what is the future of this all-Russian nation, triangle nation myth in Ukraine and Russia, in your opinion?
We historians have trouble past and predicting past. Predicting future is certainly a much more difficult task. What I can say that again, if you look on the ground of what is happening in the last 7 years, or since certainly the start of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, not just political elites, but also population at large actually are growing apart with almost every day. And it's kind of an irony that you see Putin writing about the unity when the actual policy brings very different results. Again, I see the continuation of that trend that really started in 2013 and 2014. And this is again, I can't predict the long-term future, but in the immediate future, this is certainly a major blow to the idea of the unity. I see that the same tendency is now taking shape and picking up in Belarus as well, where the Russian support for very unpopular regime, at least among the city intelligentsia, unpopular regime of Lukashenko, leads to a situation where the Russia is not viewed as a savior. Russia is not viewed as basically the country that you want to be closely associated with. For that active part of the Belarusian society, the future of Belarus is basically now in distancing itself from Russia. And I don't think that was the case even 2 years or 3 years ago.
Very good. Now, Kirill Tkachenko from Kyiv. Serhii Mykolaievich, how to explain Russian imperial ambitions against the backdrop of other nations having been able to, more or less, say goodbye to their own empires?
The disintegration of the Soviet Union happens later than the disintegration of the Ottoman, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and even British and French. So at least by a few decades. So the Russia goes through the process of the divorce from the empire later than other major European metropolis. So from that point, this is just one clear difference. And another very important difference would be related exactly to the main topic of my discussion today. That for Russia, it's not just divorcing yourself from more or less classically understood colonies or imperial possessions, like let's say Caucasus or Central Asia, or even to a degree Baltic states. For Russia, it's also a question of the reformulation of what Russianness means. Whether it is, Vera Tolz wrote a book 15, 20 years ago where she put forward 5 different models of Russian identity, and Russia is still in the process of choosing that. For, let's say, British Empire, there was no question where was an Englishman and where was someone coming from India or again, the native population even of the settled colonies like South Africa. For Russia, it's more difficult, again, because of linguistic proximity, because of the extent and success of the Russification in the 20th century in Ukraine and Belarus in particular. So Russia faces a much more complex, it faces the task of separating itself from the empire later than others, but also there is additional layer of complexity associated with the East Slavic core of the Russian Empire and then of the Soviet Union. That's why you don't see Vladimir Putin writing articles on the historical unity of Russians and Uzbeks, or Russians and Estonians or Finns or something like that. Again, that is very, very important issue, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia as well.
Very good. Now, the question from Alek Wycinska from Warsaw. You see, we have all like the main, let's say, locations on the map. So it's about the whole 19th century, the age of nationalism, and the way how to deal with it nowadays. So the question is, how can we historians communicate to the post-national West, as Ella put it, the very 19th century nation building question? Or it's kind of, if I may add something, it's like we are speaking our own language, let's say between Ukrainians, Russians, maybe Poles, and so on, which remains pretty, let's say, ununderstandable for our German, French, British, whatever audiences, or not.
Well, it made me think about Larry Wolff's book, Inventing Eastern Europe. Again, the idea there is that the Western or Central European intellectual of the 18th century would recognize and respect the differences from Europe of the real East, like China or India or something like that. But Eastern Europe, right for the separateness, actually was questioned. That was not fully reformed Europe. And to make it fully Europe, you have to Europeanize it. So basically impose the ideas, impose the, here I am already, this is not what Larry Wolff is saying, I'm kind of building on the key argument of the book, that you kind of impose particular ways of thinking and models and so on and so forth. And I don't think that situation much changed since the 18th century, even today. And in that sense, the historians who work in the studying either Asia or Africa certainly convince the colleagues in Europe or in North America that, okay, there are differences, there are different processes, they move differently. It's very difficult for what used to be Eastern Europe or what now became Eastern Europe to say that, okay, there is also, we march to our own drum in terms of the time, in terms of the challenges. And that difficulty will be there, but I don't think that there is any other way to deal with the problem, but just to insist and to demonstrate that, okay, we are not just not completely Europe and have to be civilized. Just one more push and we'll become like Europe. There are in terms of time, in terms of the dynamic of the processes, there are different processes that are going on, and the process of post-colonial development. From that point of view, again, maybe it's not will please even people in the region, but the parallels should be not necessarily drawn with Germany or with France, but also with India and with China. So again, it's changing the reference points and widening the frame in which we look at our own experience that would not be just limited to Western Europe and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, very good. And now, dear colleagues, I'm afraid we have the last question. And accidentally, maybe not, it is from Moscow. From Clemente Fedevich. So I'll try to read it because it's a long one, and I hope we'll understand what is it about. So, is it possible to say that currently the history of competition of Ukrainian and Russian ethnic projects is mostly over? Is it more properly to say about contemporary Russians and Ukrainians as political nations, consisting from multi-ethnic mixtures in Ukraine and Russia? According to the Ukrainian constitution, the Ukrainians are people of Ukraine of different nationalities. And in the Russian constitution, there is multinational people of the Russian Federation, but not Russian ethnic nation. Hence, should we write a new history of the Ukrainians because the dominating version of the Ukrainian nation history today is mostly ethnically oriented? Question mark.
Okay, well, thank you. It's an question. And what we have in Ukraine, at least in the West, in English language world, we have maybe two main narratives or two main surveys of Ukrainian history. I added the third one, The Gates of Europe, recently, but one of them is, with some simplifications, is called basically ethno-national history of Ukraine. Again, I would stress simplifications. This is by Orest Subtelny. It's not just that, but okay, for the sake of the argument. Then there is the work written by Paul Magochi, which is basically as multi-ethnic as it gets. And then in my own work, I was trying actually go beyond this dichotomy between one ethnic-based argument to multi-ethnic-based arguments, to say that, okay, in line of what Andreas Kappeler was arguing, that, okay, the multi-ethnic repeats all the mistakes of all the problems of the one ethnic narrative, multiplying them. So I was trying to look at the cultural processes and developments in Ukraine. So at least we have these three different approaches. So they're place for the third, fourth, and fifth one, I'm sure about that, but there are already things that you can choose from. I know that the same processes are taking place in Russia. There are dominant narratives that are very much Russocentric. There are also attempts of people around Ab Imperio to write a new imperial history of Russia. So again, the short answer is that yes, we should write different histories. And I would say that yes, this process is already happening and taking place. And it happens and takes place against the background of really of the formation of the new states and the nations being in the process of formation that I said, and trying also to find to themselves there for the first time really in the states of their own. This is true for Ukraine, this is true for Russia to a degree. So to figuring out where I ended up, what is the layout of that place, so who we are. So it is a process of the formation, not just states but also nation within those formations. But the dominant model, certainly in Russia, is its Russocentric model, very much ethnically based. Again, Russians are today living within the borders of the state that is more Russian than ever in, I would say, in Russian history, maybe since Ivan III, since the 15th to 16th centuries. And Ukrainians also found themselves for the first time in the state where they are the majority, and they also try to figure out who the Ukrainians are in terms of their relation to the language, to the history, to the culture. So that makes for of course very challenging but also very interesting task of writing histories.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much again, dear Serhii Mykonovich. As I said, we really hope to welcome you in Frankfurt Oder in person. Who knows, maybe next year. We'll see how the situation goes on. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your interest, for your motivation, for great questions. So what I'd like to add, if some of you will decide, which is highly advisable, to watch our discussion again, you could do it on our YouTube channel, which has the same title, Entangled History of Ukraine. You could also subscribe to it. I should also tell you that thanks to my colleagues, Bozhena and Maria, we've just started our Facebook page. So you could also follow our activities on Facebook, which is a big surprise to me, I should tell you. And last but not least, of course, we very much hope to see you also next week, next Monday, 6 p.m. Berlin time. We've had a great talk by the colleague who asked one of the questions tonight, so Ella Kwiczinska from Warsaw. It will be moderated by Bozhena Kozakiewicz, and it will actually somehow continue our today's discussion, because it will also raise the issues of colonialism, post-colonialism, way of telling the unique experiences of Eastern Europe to someone else. So thank you so much a lot. Dear Serhii, we're looking forward to your new books and projects. And yeah, let's stay in touch. Good night, good luck, and see you next week. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. Goodbye.